was murdered for the power of his ideas, and because even in the face of mortal danger, he refused to remain silent.
And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman in New York, joined by Democracy Now! Co-host Juan Gonzalez in Chicago. Hi, Juan.
Hi, Amy, and welcome to all of our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world.
Well, pressure is growing on Britain and the United States to pay reparations and apologize for expelling residents of the Chagos Archipelago in the Indian Ocean half a century ago, so the United States could build a major military base on the island of Diego Garcia, which is located halfway between Africa and Indonesia and about 1,000 miles south of India. The U.S. base at Diego Garcia played a key role in the U.S. invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan. For over 50 years, Chagosian people have been attempting to return home, but their efforts have been blocked by both the U.K. and the United States. Earlier this year, Human Rights Watch accused the two governments of committing crimes against humanity. In a moment, we'll be joined by a prominent Chagosian activist who's here in the United States visiting to meet with U.S. lawmakers and Biden administration officials. But first, let's turn to an excerpt of a video produced by Human Rights Watch titled "The Last British Colony in Africa: How Chagosians Were Forced Off Their Homeland."
In the 1960s, Britain ruled over about 18 countries and 3 territories in Africa.
Many African states were already engaged in the process of starting to fight for their independence. Mauritius was fully engaged in this process.
Britain granted independence to Mauritius in 1968, but with a major caveat: the UK would keep the Chagos Archipelago for a small price.
U.S. government officials in the era of decolonization were growing concerned about losing control of the world. So a group of officials in the U.S. Navy developed a plan to identify small islands around the world, and Diego Garcia became the prime island on which they wanted to build a base.
Diego Garcia is one of the main islands in the Chagos Archipelago, where many families had lived for generations.
The secret deal began being worked out by the U.S. and British governments in the early 1960s, where the U.S. government insists to the British that we want this base, and we want it without any local population. The British government agrees to do the dirty work of getting rid of the Chagosians in exchange for wiping away $14 million in debt that the British government owes the U.S. government.
British officials feared that if they acknowledged the permanent population of Chagos, they would have to report to the UN about the new colony they had created.
What the British do in 1965 is recharacterize the entire population of the Chagos Archipelago as contract laborers, not a permanent population, to create the ruse that there's no population.
Between 1968 and 1973, the British government removed about 1,500 people from the Chagos Archipelago to Mauritius and to the Seychelles. They were not given a choice.
The only thing I saw my mother take with her was a little chest to put our clothes in it and a mattress. That's all. Everything else we left there. They put all the dogs into a chamber and gassed them until they died.
An excerpt from a video by Human Rights Watch titled "The Last British Colony in Africa: How Chagosians Were Forced Off Their Homeland." One of the voices featured in that clip was David Vine, a professor at American University in Washington, D.C., author of Island of Shame, The Secret History of the U.S. Military on Diego Garcia. Professor Vine is also the author of Base Nation, How U.S. Military Bases Abroad Harm America and the World. He's joining us now from New York, along with Olivier Bancolt, who is the chair of the Chagos Refugees Group, the organization representing most Chagosians in exile. His recent article for Open Democracy is titled "The U.S. and U.K. Stole Our Homes, 50 years on, we're still being denied justice. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Let's begin with Olivier Bancoul. Thanks so much for being with us. Explain why you're here in the United States, and in fact, even what happened to your own family half a century ago that you're still demanding a correction for, as well as all of the Chagossians living in exile.
First of all, good morning, Hemi. First of all, thank you for giving me this opportunity to talk on behalf of my people. The reason we are here in the United States is to find out from the Biden administration and apologize for what wrong had been done to the Sagosian people. I think that the U.S. government need to change their policy concerning human rights for Sagosian people who had been recruited. We want that the people of the United States understand our position. As far as our international human rights had been banished for so many years, and we want justice to be done. We want that the U.S., who is fully responsible for what happened to our people, because of the peace, we had been having a nightmare story. And we want them to recognize and to put an end and to apologize for all wrongs that they did, and started by making some reparation for our people, like compensation and helping to resettle Sagosian on Chagos. My story, I was born on Peros Banos, one of the island of Chagos Archipelago, and I was expelled in 1968. The reason because I have our family have to come to Mauritius to have treatment for my sister who had been hurt by a will cord. But unfortunately, after 3 months, my sister passed away. And when my mom and dad decided to return, because we have left all our belongings there in a view to return, when we asked to been asked to return, we have learned that it will be impossible for us because the island had been given to America. And it is the wrong that we had been suffered, not being on our birthplace, being away from where we were born. And this is one of the reasons I want just to get more awareness of the situation and put their responsibility toward our people.
And Olivier Bancoul, who have you met with in Washington among the leaders in the United States, and do you sense any support for your demands in Congress?
Yes, of course, we are very hopeful to say that we have been able to meet with many people, especially members of Congress, members of Congress, and we met also with officials from State Department, because it's according to them, it's the first time that they hear from Sagosian what our demands are. The most important is concerning our fundamental rights and our dignity as a people. If we are a people, according to Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that everywhere, if you were born on a place, you have the right to live on the place. And we cannot accept that other people can live on our place, whereas we are declared as persona non grata. This is the main occasion, and we want to have the support of congressmen in order to find out how to present something like a letter, a resolution, or even an hearing to explain our situation and to let the U.S. government shoulder the responsibility toward our Sagosian people.
You talk about the history of the inhabitants of the Chagos Islands, the long-term history that rebuts this contention of the U.S. and Britain that there were only contract laborers there in the 60s?
Both of the government, UK and US, had lies, because they all say that before the installation of the US military base, they were not permanent inhabitant there. It's totally untrue, because people were living for more than 5 generations. I give my own example. I was born there. My father, my mother, my grandfather, grandmother, even my great-grandmother were born there. And we have never been contractual workers. We were permanent inhabitants. And life for us is very wonderful because we were living in peace and harmony. We have our culture, we have our house, we have our job. And after working hours, we used to go fishing, and we all live as one family. Suddenly, they just decided to choose Diego Garcia because it is a very strategical place, and it is a very well situated. They decided to build a U.S. military base on Diego Garcia, but forget about the fundamental rights of our people who were living in peace and harmony.
I want to play some clips of other Chagosian voices. This is Lynn Louis speaking to Human Rights Watch about her life in Chagos before she was forcibly removed from her homeland.
Life in Chagos for people was like living as one family. Everything we share, even the food we cook, we share. If there is a problem, there is always someone to help.
And this is Eliane Baptiste talking about her family story.
I moved to the UK when I was 15 years old, but my parents stayed in Mauritius. In the 1960s, hundreds of Chagosians, including my mom, were forced to leave the Chagos archipelago or not allowed to return because the British and US governments wanted to make space for a US military base. That UK-US pact had a detrimental impact for those living on the islands, as well as for future generations, causing many families to be divided. The British granted British citizenship to the Chagosians and the first generations, which allowed people like my sisters and I to move to the UK. But not everyone had the chance to, because there were limitations and restrictions, such as the age of the first generations and the spousal visas. My mom's siblings were not born on the Chagos Islands, so they and my cousins are not eligible for the British citizenship. It just makes me think that if the Chagosians were not deported, if my family, my grandparents, my mom were allowed back on the islands, none of this would have happened.
That's Eliane Baptiste. These voices, Professor David Vine, when you hear the pain of what was lost, first of all, I mean, explain from the beginning. Many have called this a crime against humanity. The U.S. and U.K. moving in, the U.S. building this military base, and aside from just building that military base, saying no Chagosians could live there.
Good morning, Amy and Juan. Indeed, this is a crime against humanity, a fundamentally racist crime against humanity that was masterminded from the beginning by U.S. government officials who seized upon the idea of building a base on Diego Garcia and getting rid of the Chagosians. And then they proceeded to pay the British government secretly $14 million to basically do the dirty work of getting rid of the Chagosians, and then proceeded to orchestrate the expulsion over the course of several years in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And from the beginning, the U.S. government has had the power. They had the power to exile the Chagosians, and now the Biden administration has the power to finally make this right. This is an outrage, a crime against humanity indeed, that should have been corrected, should never have happened, should have been corrected years ago by prior administrations. But the Biden administration now has the ability to show the world, at a time when the Biden administration is rightly criticizing other governments and their human rights records, Saudi Arabia, China, among others. At this time, the Biden administration has the ability to change U.S. policy and finally provide justice to the Chagosians by allowing them to return home, by providing compensation, by assisting with the resettlement of the Chagosians in the land of their ancestors, in their homeland, the land that has been taken from them.
And Professor Vine, sadly, the example of what happened with the Chagossians is not unique. Could you talk a little bit about these enormous bases that the United States has